听众朋友大家好，欢迎收听阿榕伯胡说科技，我是阿榕伯陈良荣。在节目开始前，要请大家来填写问卷，让我们知道你对阿榕伯胡说科技 Podcast 或者是对我的电子报的想法，给我一些建议。那填完问卷呢，还可以得到天下数位订阅半价的优惠，连结就贴在节目资讯栏。接下来就进入今天的主题。今天是很特别的一集哦，我们要来谈的是现在最夯的议题川普 2.0 以及生成式 AI 对台湾的影响。那这次的来宾呢，真的不是开玩笑的，是全世界最适合谈这个话题的人。他就是《晶片战争》的作者，美国塔夫茨大学国际历史教授 Chris Miller。所以呢，待会可能要麻烦各位听众跟我一起练习一下英文啊。那我想并不是所有听众都看过《晶片战争》这本书啦，所以我还是先简介一下米勒这个人。简单来讲，在几年前，懂半导体的跟懂国际关系政治的就是两票人，打死不相往来。但是从新冠疫情的晶片荒开始，大家才突然发现，半导体对地缘政治原来这么重要。那米勒呢，他是属于国际关系这一块的，他本来是俄罗斯专家，研究的是冷战时期的飞弹技术，一个非常冷僻的题目。结果他研究下去就发现说，原来洲际飞弹性能的关键其实是装在里面的晶片。而且呢，苏联为什么会在冷战落败，其实就是因为半导体技术落后美国。那他觉得实在太有趣了，所以就花好几年的时间研究半导体的历史，写了《晶片战争》这一本书。那这本书呢，在2022年10月3日在美国开卖，结果呢10月7日过4天而已，美国政府就发动对中国半导体业的第一波制裁，史称1007事变，真的就发生晶片战争了。结果这本书就大卖，而且还得到该年《金融时报》最佳商业书籍的大奖。你看米勒那时候才30几岁，那我都跟他开玩笑说，你的背景到底有多硬啊？美国政府居然帮你打输。那结果在天时地利人和之下呢，米勒就成为全世界极少数又懂国际政治又懂半导体的顶尖专家。那这段时间他已经变成世界级的名嘴，你几乎每个星期都可以在金融时报或者是纽约时报看到他。那待会的节目呢，有几个重点，我先帮大家摘要一下。我会问米勒说呢，他的书已经出了2年，那这段时间其实晶片战争变得更激烈了，他有什么观察？然后他其实很后悔当初黄仁勋写太少了。另外大家可能跟我一样，对于川普 2.0 非常的戒慎恐惧，因为川普选前说过，台湾偷了美国的晶片业，那他选上怎么办？我们台湾是不是要还？那米勒告诉我们不用担心啦，川普应该会维持拜登政府的基调，你不用管他的选举口号，其实跟台湾一样，选举胡说八道，选后就正经做事。好，那我们就开始。如果待会儿在 Podcast 有点听不懂，可以听晚一点上线 YouTube 上面的阿榕伯胡说科技，那个时候会配上中文字幕。好，那我们就开始咯。Hi Chris.
Hi everyone, good to see you again. How are you?
Yeah, sure. I heard that you are now a father right now.
I am, yes. We have 3 little kids actually.
Oh, already 3? Okay. I'm sorry. I just got the digital version of the book, Morris Chang's autobiography, the second part. I think you have read the first part, right?
Yes.
And if you're interested, I want to share some stories of this new one.
Well, that would be great.
Do you know Terry Guo, the founder of Foxconn?
Mm-hmm.
He is the cousin of Morris Chang's wife.
Yes, I do know that.
So you know that the first encounter of Morris Chang and Apple is by the introduction of Terry Guo. You know the story?
Yes, I knew that as well.
Wow. So, okay,
yes,
so he wrote more detail in this autobiography. And the other one is, he's considering talk to Jensen Huang to become his successor.
Yes, I saw headlines about that
Yeah.
in the news.
Yeah, and at that time, NVIDIA is not doing very well. I think it's about 2014 at that time.
Okay.
And so at that time, NVIDIA's market cap is about 1/10 of TSMC. So it's a reasonable offer. But Jensen Huang just said that I already have a job. So it has been 2 years since Chip War had published. And a lot of things happened, at least for me. A lot of dramatic events happened in these 2 years. So anything you want to share with your reader about these 2 years?
Well, I think the big change that to some extent we all knew was coming, but we were all surprised by the speed was artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
I published Chip War in October 2022, the English translation. And November 2022, ChatGPT was released, and that set off a huge surge in investment in data centers and NVIDIA's stock price soaring. And that has been a surprise, just the scale of capabilities, of investment and the companies that have really reoriented their business models around AI. And so that's been the biggest, I think, unexpected change to the semiconductor ecosystem since Chip War was published. And when I think back on the book, Jensen Huang, I have an entire chapter on Jensen Huang and NVIDIA, but only one.
You should write more.
I should have had many chapters.
Yeah, that's one thing. Any other things?
Well, I think the other big trend, which I think it was foreshadowed in the book, but has certainly materialized, has been the intensification of the China-US technology competition. And I think here as well, the English version of Chip War was published on October 4th. And then 3 days later, on October 7th, in 2022, the White House announced the first round of export controls that the Biden administration imposed on AI processors and chip-making equipment to China. And that has set off a round of both U.S. and Chinese and other measures around this technology competition. And so obviously that was already developing, but the magnitude at which it played out was also, I think, something that has been a big change over the last 2 years.
So you told me that your next book will be about AI. Is that still going?
Well, I have aspirations of writing a book on AI and trying to understand what the history of computing says about the future of AI. I haven't done nearly as much work as I'd like because semiconductors are keeping me very busy at the moment. But but hopefully next year I'll have more time to dig into the history of computing to understand what the history tells us about the present day.
Okay, so you're a historian, so you were digging in the history first.
That's exactly right. And I think for all types of technology, there's plenty of people who have views about where it's going, but actually looking at the past is probably the best way to ascertain what's actually new and what is not new, but something we've seen many times before. And I think artificial intelligence is a sphere where actually we've seen a lot of these trends before. A lot of the same themes are present, even if the technology is obviously different today than it was several decades ago.
Yeah. AI is right now, it's more important, like you just mentioned, than everybody has expected. And how does it change the dynamics between US, China, and maybe Taiwan?
Yeah, I think it does change the dynamics in a couple of ways. I think first, it accentuates the importance of semiconductors because the trend over the past several years has been if you want to train a better AI system, you need to train a bigger AI system. And the fact that most of the world's AI systems are trained on NVIDIA GPUs, and that basically all GPUs, NVIDIA's as well as all others, are manufactured by TSMC, except for those that are produced by Huawei in China, means that TSMC has become even more important than it already was, because it's only a slight exaggeration to say that all progress in AI depends on TSMC. So for the US, for China, and for Taiwan, AI has been a real change. I think actually Taiwan might be the country that's been most impacted by AI. Just because the entire electronic supply chain in Taiwan is also the AI supply chain. And I think more than any other country, Taiwan can claim to really have been present at the creation of the computing power that makes AI possible. And although AI has been obviously very influential in the US and to some degree in China, I think Taiwan's actually probably been the most impacted by AI already, just because Taiwanese companies are absolutely at the center of producing the chips that make AI possible.
Yeah, is that surprise you? You know, even the tech reporter in Taiwan, we were surprised to find that most of the AI servers is manufactured in Taiwan, and China and Japan cannot take any share from it. We know they're good, but I didn't know they're that good.
Yeah, I think it is surprising. And I think there's a couple of reasons, a couple of explanations for it. I think, one, although Taiwanese firms have opened a lot of factories in China over the past decade or two, a lot of the expertise has remained in Taiwan for the entire electronics supply chain. So I think that's one reason. I think, second, the role of TSMC is obviously critically important, and it's not just TSMC producing the chips; it's the entire supply chain oriented around TSMC. And I think the third factor that's also been pretty significant is the tech war and the US export controls, which make it illegal to ship certain types of GPUs to China. So you can't do your assembly in China at all, and you're probably not going to risk having other components going into your AI server being sourced from China, at least unless they're like really commoditized components. And so I think that tech war dynamic was also already visible in 2022 when ChatGPT was released. And so as companies tried to ramp up their production, they knew they wanted to ramp not at all relying on a Chinese supply chain, but relying on a Taiwanese supply chain instead. And so, but it has been pretty extraordinary, the extent to which you really can't find an AI system of any scale that doesn't rely at a really fundamental level on hardware from Taiwan.
Yeah, but we and the industry is still worried that AI servers manufacturing in Taiwan will not sustainable because some of the customers were asking for no China, no Taiwan supply chain. Some of the customers are asking them to move to Mexico and to maybe, Do you think eventually, due to the geopolitical reason, the AI server will not stay in Taiwan for long?
I think that's probably a fair assumption. But I also think that the assembly process alone is probably not super high value add. It's the design of not just the components for this year's AI server, it's the design of components for next year's AI server. That's where the economic value really is. And so just like I think assembly for many types of goods is spread in many different countries, I probably wouldn't fixate over where is final assembly happening. I'd fix over where is the expertise to get the heat dissipation right so that you don't have overheating in your server. Those are the components that you actually are willing to pay money for. And I think right now the world's premier source of expertise in how do you design the AI server is in Taiwan. And that's what I would probably focus on if I were an economic policymaker in Taiwan or a business person in Taiwan is how do you maximize that expertise rather than how do you make sure every single server is assembled on shore.
So maybe design in Taiwan and assembled in Mexico and maybe Texas.
I think, I think that's right. And, I think that's been the trend in most electronics is that when they're first pioneered, you have really concentrated manufacturing. And then manufacturing supply chains become more complex because you're trying to both optimize around tariff walls, optimize around specifications for different markets. And so today, if you look at many electronics, there's manufacturing bases in Southeast Asia and India and wherever else. And that doesn't mean that the economic value is distributed as widely as the manufacturing bases are located.
Yeah, but it will impact the export data. It will impact the number of GDP growth.
Well, it's interesting. I think certainly it's watching Taiwanese export data to the US, you see the impact of AI servers very, very clearly. Yeah. Huge, for sure. It's interesting looking at NVIDIA doesn't contribute at all to US export data. It exports nothing other than probably a little bit of intellectual property. And so the trade data becomes, I think, useful but less useful over time, the more intellectual property you have and the more innovation that you have that is not directly tied to exporting components. And so it's probably a good thing for Taiwan if over time the export data maps on less closely with the success of Taiwanese companies, because I think that's actually a sign you're moving higher and higher up the value chain.
Yeah. That next year, US may be the largest export destination, overpassing China for Taiwan.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and I think there's a big shift underway. And I think it's partly about the US, but also partly about Southeast Asia. And even, I think in the long run, India as well is an interesting trade partner for Taiwan to watch. And I think about what are the implications if Apple is going to assemble 15 or 20 or 30 or 40% of iPhones in India?
Yeah.
It means there's going to be a lot more direct relationships, not between Taiwan and Foxconn factories in China, but Taiwan and Tata assembly facilities in India. And so that is a really interesting trend to watch.
Yeah, more chips from TSMC will export to India.
Yep.
And already, this year, the export number to Malaysia is already surging because the AI chips to Malaysia.
I think it's a good leading indicator for how electronic supply chains in general are changing. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the Taiwan-China trade was very, very tight because that's how electronics were assembled. They were chips produced in Taiwan, assembled in China. Now, obviously, there's a lot more, a lot is in flux in that market. And certainly, I think Taiwan-China trade will remain substantial, but I think the trend is for much more trade with Southeast Asia and India and Mexico and other markets.
Yeah, since we're talking about supply chain, I think it's good timing to talking about Donald Trump, the Trump 2.0. Everybody is talking about. I think you have been asking for many times. So yeah, like we mentioned before, Trump 1.0 is actually very good to Taiwan because the trade war and the server line go back to Taiwan. So right now, Taiwan has a new export industry, AI server. But the Trump 2.0 actually, we were kind of worried because Mr. Trump has already said that Taiwan stole the chip industry from the US. And he said that the CHIP Act is bad. So people was wondering whether TSMC can get their money from CHIP Act. And if Trump said that we stole the chip business from the US, how should we pay back?
Well, I think on the CHIPS Act, and to start there,
Yeah.
My sense is that Trump did one time on the campaign trail criticize the CHIPS Act. But it's also the case that the CHIPS Act emerged when he was president, and TSMC's investment in Arizona happened in large part because some of the senior officials from the Trump administration were pushing for it. And so I think that dynamic suggests that actually you can, I think, worry less about the campaign rhetoric because I think there's a lot of support for the CHIPS Act in people around Trump as well as in Congress, where there's both Republicans and Democrats and in pretty vocal favor. I think for the U.S.-Taiwan relationship in general, there's a number of different facets. There's the trade facet. Taiwan is running a larger trade surplus, which if you're a trade hawk around Trump, people like Robert Lighthizer, they're worried about the U.S. trade deficit. So anyone running a trade surplus is on the opposite side of that. So there will be concerns, I think, around the balance of trade. But I think that's just one issue of many. I think a second concern is around defense spending. And I think the Trump administration in the first term they were asking U.S. allies and partners to spend more on defense. And I think they will ask that again when Trump is back in January. That's not really a change for Taiwan because Biden was asking the same thing. And so the U.S. will keep asking for more defense spending. And I think the third issue, which is both good and bad for Taiwan, is artificial intelligence and its importance. On the one hand, I think the significance of AI does induce some people around Trump to say we must have all of that at home, all the capabilities to produce AI server assembly, GPU production, et cetera. But of course, the reality is that's hard to get all domestically, maybe even impossible. And I think the counter argument is that, look, all of the leading technology companies in the US, not just NVIDIA, but Meta and Microsoft and others, they're working with TSMC to produce their GPUs and their ASICs for AI. And so you're going to have a really strong, I think, voice in Silicon Valley saying, actually, let's prioritize the Taiwan partnership because in addition to the political and security issues, Taiwan is the central partner for AI. And so I actually think the next 4 years are going to be, there will always be, I think, some level of drama in Trump's foreign policy. But if I had to guess, I would say that actually a lot of the concerns that I think people in Taiwan have about the new administration are probably overstating the risk. And in reality, we're going to see an administration that is pushing for kind of similar things that the Biden team and the first Trump administration pushed for, which is more investment in the U.S., more spending on defense, but also a closer business and political relationship between the two countries. And I think that's something that, for the past 4 years and then the prior administration, Taiwan found in general was not just acceptable, but in its interests as well.
Yeah, since you mentioned that more spending in defense, right now it's like we spend more actually in previous years, but we cannot get the weapon delivered on time from the U.S. So
yep, I think the new administration will be sympathetic to that argument. I think there's interesting. The timing of weapon shipments is partially a question of supply chains and partly a question of politics and the relationship with Beijing. And I suspect the new administration will be more willing to test relations with Beijing on weapons shipments. I think whether they can improve supply chains for weapons production, that's a different question. I don't know about that.
Yeah, but the willingness to sell more powerful weapons is kind of a trend for the new administration. Is that?
I agree.
And there's one trend right now some activities is engaging that maybe the U.S. weapon can be manufactured by Taiwanese company. The kind of cooperation is working right now, like drones. They were talking about drones and other new weapons, more digitalized weapons. Do you think that kind of trend will continue to outsource more weapons to be manufactured by Taiwanese?
I do think that's likely. And one of the interesting news stories of the past month was that China cut off battery shipments to a U.S. drone manufacturer called Skydio, which is one of the leading U.S. drone manufacturers. And I think all of the drone manufacturers in the U.S. have been trying to find non-China component suppliers for all their components. And what they find is that there's a lot you just can't get in the U.S. And Taiwan as well as Japan are kind of two key partners for building out a drone supply chain. But there's some things that you need to rely on Taiwanese suppliers for. And so I think that has both in, I think, Taipei and in Washington underscored the relevance of cooperation in this sphere. And so I wouldn't be at all surprised to see a lot closer cooperation around defense production.
Yeah, but we don't have battery manufacturing in Taiwan also. It's controlled by...
The problem is no one does.
Just China. No, South Korea have and Japan have, but they're much more expensive than Chinese ones.
Yep. What I think for the simplest drones, which are kind of like consumer electronics, so much of that is centered in China. So it is, but I've talked to some of the drone manufacturers and they'll say, yes, in theory, you can find a Japanese company to make it, but in reality, they produce at different scale, different price points. And so it's really a challenging process to get them to produce something small enough, light enough, and cheap enough to make it viable for a simple drone.
Yeah.欢迎回到阿榕伯胡说科技，我是阿榕伯。我们今天的来宾是人在波士顿的晶片战争作者，美国塔夫茨大学国际历史教授 Chris Miller。我们继续听下半段的访问。So maybe we can talk a little bit about one world, two system. The one system is governed by the Chinese supply chain, and the other is maybe led by the U.S. and the other supply chain. China wants to be self-sufficient in all supply chain, like the battery you mentioned. So do you think that kind of trend will continue? One world, two system?
Yeah, I do think it will continue. I think we're not going to reach a point of complete decoupling, which is the word that some people use, which implies that there won't be any trade or connections. I don't think that's right. Yeah. But I think a bifurcation. As especially in the high-tech sphere, you end up with two different segments. That seems highly likely. And I think it's likely both because of the geopolitics, the concerns about security in East Asia, but it's also, I think, driven by China's domestic economic model. And so I think one of the really interesting charts to look at is China's imports of manufactured goods as a share of GDP, which just falls every single year because China makes an increasingly large share of the manufactured goods that it needs domestically. And so today there's really only two categories of manufactured goods where China is a major net importer. And it's first semiconductors and second semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Almost everything else China is basically self-sufficient in. And of course,
crude oil.
If you take manufactured goods only,
okay.
So commodities, yes,
okay.
Yes. China imports lots of crude oil, of copper, of soybeans, but for manufactured goods, it's just semiconductors and chip making equipment are the two main categories of net import. And I think it's an interesting question to ask. By 2030, how many chips will China be importing? Because I think for anything that is low end or mid range, China will be self-sufficient. I think for many types of memory chips, they're making a lot of progress in DRAM, more progress than people expected. And we'll see how successful SMIC is at the high end. But I think they're going to be much more self-sufficient than they are today. And if China doesn't need to buy any manufactured goods from abroad, you start to have this dynamic of two systems being created just by China's own industrial policy, because it's not acquiring any goods from the outside world except for simple commodities. And so that's the other key trend that I think is really deeply built into the economic policy framework in China. And so even if you set aside the geopolitics, I think that dynamic of China wanting to be self-sufficient and having the capability of being pretty substantially self-sufficient, I think that dynamic continues for the foreseeable future, at least so long as Xi is in power.
Yeah, but in terms of AI, that kind of trend maybe is not good for China. At least that's what people told me because, my colleague went to Shenzhen, I think last month, and you know that the H100, A100 is already banned from selling to China, but she could find it in the gray market in Shenzhen. She can buy A100 in cash and H100, you have to pay money and then wait for a few days. But we ask people who is building the AI models in Beijing, they say they have efficient AI chips. The US policy to ban the AI chips is not the problem for them, at least for now. So that's confusing because for us, the AI model in China is lagging behind the US. Why they say that they have enough chips?
No, I think it's a really interesting question. So if you listen to some of the people who are trying to train very big models, so like the founder of DeepSeek, which is one of the leading Chinese companies, was interviewed recently. And his view is that if you want to train a very, very large foundation model, then you still do struggle to get access to the number of NVIDIA chips that you need. But if you're a company that's trying to build on top of an open source model like Llama that Facebook released, you don't need that many chips. The compute requirements are much lower. And so whether you're using Huawei's Ascend chips or whether you're using a small volume of NVIDIA chips that you've acquired, you got enough. I think that the more interesting question to me is why does it seem like demand for AI services is lower in China than it is, for example, in the US? But if you look at the amount of dollars spent on OpenAI subscriptions in the US versus the best metrics we have for revenue going to Chinese AI firms, there's no comparison. It's the US ecosystem far ahead. And it's not primarily a story of chips, I don't think. It's a story of something else. I think it speaks to the challenge that Chinese firms have faced across the software and consumer internet space, where they've been very successful domestically. The Chinese domestic ecosystem is largely local firms, Tencent, Alibaba, et cetera. But in the export market, they've largely failed. Only in a couple instances in Southeast Asia have Chinese tech firms succeeded, but in most of the world, they've had no success in the export market. And if you look at their financials, you find that almost all of their money is made domestically. And so China's actually had a long-term challenge of producing software products for export. And I wonder if that's related to the fact that domestically, it's just a slow process of generating demand for AI services, and perhaps Chinese companies are worse at that for business model reasons rather than for technology reasons.
That's interesting because you recall generative AI, AI 2.0, and the previous one, AI 1.0. The first wave of a big AI event is maybe triggered by the AlphaGo. The major use of that time is surveillance and face recognition. At that time, China is leading. Everybody tell that China is leading the world, leading the US. And everybody is using that all over China. It's ahead of everyone. Why, when there comes generative AI, they're lagging in application?
Yeah. That's a great question. I don't know that I have a good answer. I'll give you a hypothesis, which is that facial recognition is a very narrow use case. And I think you're right that demand initially was coming above all from government surveillance purposes. And there's not broad application of facial recognition beyond really simple things like authenticating that it's me when I look at my phone. No one's going to pay very large sums of money for that, and you pay for it once when you have that particular application put in your phone. Whereas generative AI is general. It can be used in all sorts of applications, and we're still figuring out what the most useful applications will be. And I have a pretty high level of confidence that some of the companies that will make the most money off of generative AI have yet to be founded. They're going to be founded over the next couple of years. And so I think the scope for creating businesses on top of generative AI is 1,000 or 1,000,000 times larger than the scope for creating businesses on top of facial recognition. Even though we all do use facial recognition on a regular basis, it's just a pretty straightforward and narrow task. Generative AI is much, much harder. It's harder technically, but it's also harder in terms of the business model. How do you find a way to monetize it?
You asked a very good question, I think, in your previous podcast, that all the US CSP cloud service providers like Google and Microsoft, they were spending record high capex this year. Microsoft's maybe surpassing $50 billion this year. But the Chinese counterpart, Baidu, Alibaba, is not spending that much. They didn't mention that they want to raise their capex. So why don't they invest the future?
I have two hypotheses, which I'm not sure about, but I think are right. One is that there is a lot more investment in AI products in the US than in China. And a lot of the capex that Microsoft and Google and Amazon are undertaking is actually to serve AI companies. So the best example is Microsoft and OpenAI, which are deeply interlinked, but that's just one of many examples. And so if you want to serve an AI product company, you've got to have a whole lot of GPUs ready to offer them. So that's one. But I think the second answer, which is probably more important in the long run, is maybe surprising, which is that I think US enterprises, so people that aren't in the AI space, aren't even in the tech space, are exploring AI pretty aggressively. And I think that Chinese enterprises are not. And so if you look, for example, at financial services, in the US, financial services firms are very, very savvy when it comes to IT. They're very, very good with their data. They spend a lot of money on IT services, and they're all exploring, what does AI mean for our business, for offering better products, for marketing, for trading across the board. And financial services are one of the key drivers of cloud service provision in general. And I think when Microsoft or Google looks at their AI-focused cloud business, they're looking at financial services as an early adopter. In China, the big four banks are state-owned. And I think because of that, they're much less capable, much less focused on IT in general. And I think they're much less excited about investing in AI-driven services because they just aren't as hard charging. They're not as focused. You have all the pathologies of state-owned firms. And if that's just one sector, but I think it gives you an example of why the enterprise software market in China has always been much less well developed. And I think if those are your customers or your potential customers, and you're Alibaba thinking about your cloud business, you'd probably not want to be investing a whole lot if you think they're going to be slow moving and less interested in AI services.
And I asked that question to a consultant in Beijing. He said that he thinks it's because the political climate. Because the Alibaba, Baidu, they were being crushed by the government before. So maybe they were worried that if they spend a lot of money and then train a very good AI model, and the government banned them from using it. So
that could well be true. I always think it's fascinating to look at Jack Ma.
Yeah.
Whenever Jack Ma visits China, it makes it into the news. Which I think tells you just how repressed I think the domestic technology investment system is right now. And if you look at venture capital fundraising, you get a similar data point.
Mm-hmm. And if we go back to the one world, two system question, one thing that I want to ask you is that you're a Russian expert. We previously think if there's a one world, two system, and China will be about only China, 1.4 billion people. But right now, Russia, kind of like part of the China camp. This year, the Chinese car export number has surged, and I think most of them will come to Russia. So is that Russia and maybe Africa and South America will be another home market for China? So that group will be much bigger than we have expected.
Yeah. I think it depends on which type of product you're looking at. I think Russia is certainly going to be in the Chinese camp for a variety of reasons, both because they trust China more, because the West doesn't allow many types of products to be sold to Russia. And I think that'll persist into the future. I think for the rest of the world, whether it's Africa, whether it's Southeast Asia, whether it's India, whether it's South America, I think it'll depend on products. So if you look at manufactured goods like electric vehicles, I think it's clear Chinese electric vehicles are going to win everywhere they're allowed to compete. They're going to win in Southeast Asia. They're going to win in Europe. They're not going to be allowed to compete in the US, but if they were allowed to compete, they would win in the US too, because they're just as good and substantially cheaper than existing cars. I think if you're looking at digital capabilities, though, it's a different story. China's not been very successful at exporting digital services or selling digital services in South America, for example. Not been very successful in India relative to the US tech giants. And so I would bet when it comes to anything that is AI first, I would bet on Silicon Valley beating Chinese competitors, just because that's the track record when it comes to software and digital services in countries outside of China. And so I think it'll be a mixed picture. And we're going to see, I think, an interesting test over the next couple of years in the automotive space, where China is going to, I think, have success after success in winning market share. And it's going to impose really tough dilemmas for existing car producers. Certainly for Europe, which has already decided to impose tariffs on Chinese cars. But for Japan, it's not going to let any Chinese cars in the Japanese market. But Toyota sells a lot of cars in Southeast Asia, and it's going to lose a lot there. But I would differentiate between the sort of manufactured goods, where China's got the quality and got the price advantage, versus digital services, where for a variety of reasons, Chinese firms have struggled in the past.
China will make a killing manufacturing goods in developing market, but not digital service.
Yeah. And I think maybe one small amendment is that Chinese companies might not make any money in the process, because one of the reasons prices are so low is that they don't make any money, and they're willing to produce at close to zero margins, where firms in the rest of the world are not.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we Taiwanese used to do that too. The PC makers, 10 or 20 years ago, their margin is so low, 3%, 4%. So nobody can get into that market because the margin is too low. So no Chinese would like to go to that market to make PC, because they cannot make money, since they don't have the scale like incumbent Taiwanese makers. But after few years, right now, there were AI server makers. They make much more money than before. So is that possible? Even Chinese, they didn't make much money, except BYD. BYD make a lot of money. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at, there's different ways you can measure this, but you can look at the average profit margin of Chinese firms versus US firms, for example. And you find that just across the board, Chinese firms are generally less profitable. And what's even more interesting is that if you look at the segments of the economy where Chinese firms are profitable, it's segments like financial services, where they're profitable not because they're competitive, but because the state, it's a monopoly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I think the electric vehicle space is an interesting one. BYD is the outlier. Everyone else in the Chinese EV space doesn't make money and will struggle to make money, I suspect. Batteries, similar story. Other than CATL, it's been a pretty bad couple of years for anyone in the battery space. So it's good news if you're measuring market share. And I think there are certainly people in policymaking circles in Beijing who only know how to measure market share. But if you're measuring profitability, I think that strategy looks a lot less compelling. I think one of the key dilemmas that the international economic system faces right now is that you've got the world's largest exporter exporting partly on market principles, because there are private firms that are seeking a profit, but a substantial share of the output is driven less by market forces than by the government pouring money in manufacturing, offering cheap credit to exporters in critical sectors. And it's not always a market-driven process. And that's okay if you're a small economy doing that, because the distortion is small. If you're a big economy doing that, suddenly the impact is huge. And that's what we're seeing, I think, in pretty much every segment of the world economy where China's competitive. Maybe one data point. I had a chance to visit Korea a couple times this fall, and I was struck by how every major Korean conglomerate, they all had multiple business segments where they were facing a huge challenge from China.
Yeah.
Shipbuilding, petrochemicals, memory chips, across the board. And that was a really striking dynamic.
Yeah, the business model of South Korea is not doing quite well at this moment. So,
Absolutely.
Recently they're doing a lot of case study, and a lot of their scholars came to Taiwan to study TSMC, because IC foundry is the only sector that China has nearly no influence outside China.
Yep.
So can we go back to talk about TSMC? One thing that surprised me this year is that Intel is dropping so quickly. So suddenly TSMC is like no competitor. And it is very dangerous situation for a small country like Taiwan to have a big company so important like TSMC and no competitor. So we're worrying about whether there will be an antitrust issue, that kind of thing in moving on next few years. What would you suggest?
Well, I think it's right to be concerned about antitrust issues. I think it's hard to find a trillion-dollar technology company that hasn't faced antitrust issues. Whether you're Microsoft or Google, you face antitrust issues. People talk about NVIDIA and antitrust issues. So I think we shouldn't be surprised if TSMC faces a similar set of questions. I think in the history of the chip industry, there's a number of instances that I think also suggest concern. Intel, of course, had its own antitrust issues for some time, and the solution was eventually to make AMD the second source to co-license the IP. And that one could imagine scenarios in the future where TSMC does something similar. I'm sure there would be resistance to that for obvious reasons, but that's imaginable as the future, especially if
license the technology to the other foreign companies. Is that what you were talking about?
Exactly. Yes. I'm not saying that's a good idea. I'm saying I could imagine that as one potential solution among many. I think it's also possible, though, that TSMC continues to have 90% or so of the advanced foundry business, but either Intel or Samsung stay in the foundry business to some degree and provide a little bit of competition. I think for Samsung, the leadership thus far has been very supportive of foundry, even though the business case hasn't worked out to the extent that they've been hoping. And Samsung is a very complex company where the founding family is very influential. And so one can imagine them staying in foundry for some time, even if it's not super profitable in the short run. And Intel has a somewhat similar dynamic in that the U.S. government would like to have a U.S. player, or at least two players in the market. And I think we've seen over the last couple of years, U.S. government efforts to try to support Intel to some degree. So, for example, in addition to the CHIPS Act, which benefits a number of different companies, Intel received a grant to provide chips to the U.S. national security apparatus via what they call the Secure Enclave program, which is both a real service Intel's providing, but also I think a way to try to help Intel a little bit. And so I think it's also possible to imagine ways in which the U.S. government might try to intervene a bit more to help keep Intel going. And so it certainly seems possible that TSMC manages to be the 90% player in the market, but to have a bit of competition, and that's stable. But I think if TSMC finds that it's the 98% player for a long time, then the history of tech companies suggests that yes, there will be antitrust questions that will be asked.
So the best solution you suggest for TSMC is kind of to help to raise a competitor. Maybe
I don't think any companies want to help their competitors, but
you mentioned AMD.
Yeah. Well, I think Intel and AMD they had about 2 decades worth of lawsuits before they reached a stable equilibrium. So I don't know how it's going to play out, but I think it is an important question.
People in Japan is discussing that maybe TSMC can license the technology to Rapidus. That one in Hokkaido. Right now they're using IBM's technology, but IBM is not very capable at manufacturing real stuff. So I think people is working on that.
Well, I imagine there will be there's strong arguments against licensing because, of course, TSMC's value is largely around controlling that intellectual property. But I think you're right that if you are the 90% player for too long, you have to think about how do you position yourself.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris.
All right. Well, very good to see you. Yeah. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
更完整的晶片局势解析 ，Chris Miller 将会在2025年的天下经济论坛现场揭晓。想了解的听众朋友，欢迎参考资讯栏。其次所剩不多，赶快把握。阿榕伯胡说科技是隔周4下午5点播出，下次更新时间是1月2日，请听众朋友准时锁定，并到 Apple Podcast 追踪听天下，给我们5颗星。有什么想胡说的，也欢迎留言给阿榕伯。另外还可以订阅我的电子报，全方位补给科技趋势。我们下次见，拜拜。